So good evening, everybody, and welcome to the Path of Awakening Buddhist Center's course. We're working our way through Volume 1 of the Profound Treasury of the Ocean of Dharma. Tonight we're doing chapters 56 and 57. So who is leading off? Is it Dan? Great.
Yeah.
Barry, I've set on recording if you have to. And Dan, take it away.
Okay. Gallery view here. Okay. So now the good news. I always feel like some of these chapters could be called, do you want the good news or do you want the bad news? Anyway, this one felt to me just like the good news. Anyway, chapter 57, Awakening and Blossoming. And Chogyam Trungpa starts out in the opening, the summary paragraph in the beginning with the important statement said that the Buddha said that suffering should be known. Right? The origin of suffering should be known, should be renounced. The cessation of suffering should be realized, and the path should be regarded as the truth to resolution. So he begins off with the third noble truth, and that is the truth of cessation of suffering. And he starts out by saying that we should get rid of the fictitious stories we have about how great it is to get there and become somebody at last. Such ideas may be obstacles. And, he's basically saying we have to drop the concept of the cessation of suffering. And he asks whether we have to use our imagination or whether we actually can experience a sense of relief or freedom, and then goes on to say that imagination does not play a very important role. It does not help us at all in getting results, because our experience of freedom or liberation are quite sparse and minute, but when we do have an occasional glimpse of freedom, we try to catch it. So we lose it, but it is possible to extend such glimpses. And going on to continue with that line of thought, that the truth of cessation, the cessation of suffering, is a personal discovery. It's not mystical, it's not magical, it's not conceptual in reality, and it does not have any connotations of religion or psychology. It is simply our experience. And as examples, he goes on to say that if you spill boiling water on your hand, it's a personal experience. You get hurt. And then my personal favorite example, if you have an orgasm, it is your personal experience. Nobody else experiences it. And he says, based on that fact that somebody in the past has already experienced it, he's referring to the Buddha, that you too will experience it sooner or later, although there is no guarantee, right? The person who has already experienced the cessation of suffering is the Buddha, right? The Sanskrit word is translated into Tibetan as Sangye. Sang means awake, Ye means expansion or blossoming. So the word Sang is awakening from the sleep of pain, and within the pain there is suffering and unawareness. And Ye is like the blossoming of a flower, so Sangye is awakening and blossoming. And since you are awake, he goes on to say, the knowable has become known to you through awareness and mindfulness, right? This is the method, our practice, awareness and mindfulness, where we collect these bundles of knowledge, as he says, and the knowable has become known. And when, and often in our meditation, one of the directions is that the space of awareness that we occupy and that we're becoming aware of while we practice, he refers to the six, not he, but Buddhism refers to the six knowables, which are our sense perceptions, the five sense perceptions that we're used to, sights, sounds, smells, tastes, tactile perceptions. And then the sixth in Buddhism is thoughts and mental events as well. We regard them as we would any other sense perception. And possibly we have glimpses of Sangye as happening endlessly, although we may think that we are fooling ourselves, and sometimes we are fooling ourselves, but that element of awareness and the glimpses of awakening that take place are constantly happening, and we're not aware of them. And through practice, we can become aware that this is happening constantly. That the glimpses, the awareness is there. We don't have to create it. We just have to find what's already there and remove remove the obstacles we have to seeing it, the obscurations. He says, according to the third noble truth, cessation is possible. And on that path of the four noble truths, we are trying to become Buddhas, real Buddhas, real Sangyas, right? We have realized awakening and blossoming through our practice. The three categories of samsara is what he describes as the main obstacles to awareness and awakening, and the obstacles to becoming a Buddha, an awakened one, right? The Tibetan word for samsara, and I'm pretty much reading from the text here, is korwa, kor meaning spinning or circulating, and wa meaning ness. So karwa means to spin, or those who are spinning around. Korwa or samsara is equated with the ocean because the ocean is continually circulating. And samsara is endless circulation. The samsaric ocean is based on three categories: the essence, the cause, and the result. Okay. The essence of samsara is bewilderment, confusion. The essence of samsara is the complete opposite of Buddha or awakening from suffering. It is ignorance, stupidity, and basic bewilderment. Right. So we are basically confused. We are, in the when we talk about aversion, ignorance, and passion as the three defilements. That ignorance is the kind of delusional state that we're in, the misunderstanding of reality based on our the filters that have been so conditioned and the lenses that we see through that have become so habitual and so conditioned that we live in this state of ignorance and we don't even know it because we're in it, and this is our habitual way of looking at things. Bewilderment is a psychological state that we all experience. It includes the dream state, it includes the sleep state, and it includes the fictions that our ego is constantly weaving and that we're constantly lost in. And this being lost in thought is the bewilderment, or the, as he refers to it, it can be the dream state while we are totally awake but just lost in thought. Some people call it sleepwalking through life because we're just constantly lost in thought and not being aware of the knowables just as they are. And due to this bewilderment, we are constantly drifting around. We're not knowing exactly what is happening, and it's the opposite of awareness, right? So not seeing, not knowing, being confused, not experiencing what is happening, that's the essence of samsara. The cause of samsara is fixation. This is our attachment to thoughts, our fixating on certain ideas, fixating on certain ways of seeing things, and rather than seeing them as being fixated and attached to certain thoughts, we just see them as the way that we're looking at things, and we don't realize them as habitual conditioned attachments to a way of thinking or feeling or seeing or our responses, right? And he calls it the cause is holding on to vague concepts, is what he calls fixation, right? And he goes on to give the translation in Tibetan, which is Zinpa, meaning Zin is to hold, and Pa makes it a noun, so Zinpa means fixation or grasping. You know, when we see this, we have the tendency to want to grasp onto and hold pleasant thoughts and pleasant feelings, and obviously the opposite is we want to avoid unpleasant and you know, uncomfortable feelings. And we all have this, you know, natural tendency through condition to want to get rid of the unpleasant feelings and you know, hold on to the pleasant feelings, and that's fixation. So, but in doing so, when we are so attached, we begin to behave like a ping pong ball, this is the analogy, and he says, which does not possess any intelligence, I guess implying that we're not using our intelligence if we're just, you know, being, you know, back and forth like a ping pong ball, and we're just responding to our environment, and we're in a constant state of bouncing back and forth like a ping pong ball. All right. Says we would like to express ourselves if we feel we are undermined or if we're not acknowledged, you know, which is feeding the ego's need to be seen and to be recognized, and we feel we have to do something about that. So we, as he says, we like to stick our neck out, and then he says, but of course, again, we are ping pong, meaning we're going back and forth. Because if we're constantly responding to the environment as, you know, as what we're trying to respond to, the external source, in terms of being recognized and being seen and, you know, getting our thoughts across, we're constantly going to be in a state of being bounced back and forth, in a constant state of agitation or, you know, anxiety, or just, you know, feeling off center and unbalanced. Because if we're, you know, if we're reacting to our environment, we're at the mercy of our environment, especially if we're not aware of it. We're just doing it out of conditioned, you know, reflex. We're just going to be going back and forth and at the mercy of our environment rather than just being in simple awareness, right? Because if we're constantly trying to please our environment or control our experience, we never feel perfectly right. Again, reading from the text, because based on this neurotic game, we keep being ping-ponged, right? The more we try to look to our environment, to how we should be and how we're being, you know, received and recognized and perceived, we're going to be ping-ponged back and forth all the time. And we're going to feel like a ping pong ball. We're going to feel agitated. We're going to try to constantly, you know, regain our center, our sense of balance, and instead we just go back and forth. And the result of all this is suffering. So this is the cause of suffering. This is what needs to be known, because we can only, you know, detach ourselves from the suffering. We can only, you know, feel that freedom and the relief from the suffering if we can identify that we are doing this. And the essence of samsara is bewilderment, and the cause of samsara is fixation, right? And the result is suffering, right? So we are in a bewildered, confused, you know, state of being because we're not seeing, you know, just awareness as it is. We're not being aware as it is, not seeing clearly as what is meant by Vipassana awareness meditation. We're not clear seeing, and because of this bewilderment, we are fixated on things, and this is what results in suffering, right? And when we realize this process, we can begin to see the dizziness that it causes, as he calls it, and we begin to see how we are ping pong balled back and forth. We feel dizzy, he says, we ache all over our body because we've been bounced back and forth so much. And I think we can all relate to that, because if we're constantly trying to regain our center and feel, that we're in control of our experience, that we can take this tension out in our body, and it can cause us to tighten up, and it cause us to be uncomfortable, and actually cause us physical pain. And he says this is the definition of samsara, right? So to repeat, he says cessation is possible, and this is the third noble truth, right? That what we're doing is preventing samsara, preventing that endless cycle of trying to, find our place, trying to control our experience. And we can prevent our samsara, we can prevent samsara, we can prevent this cycle, or, cause the cessation of suffering by behaving like awakened ones, or the Buddha, or a Buddha, right? The only way we could identify ourselves with even a pinch of this experience, he goes on to say, of Buddhahood, is through the experience of awareness and mindfulness. In other words, the only way we can get there is through our practice, the practice that we practice here every day and at any time it occurs to you. Just to experience awareness as it is, as our as our sense perceptions arise and subside, as our thoughts and feelings arise and subside, and just see them as they are, without putting filters on them, without putting lenses, without seeing through the lenses of labeling them as good or bad, or needing to get rid of certain thoughts, certain feelings, needing to hold on to certain thoughts and feelings. And that's the skill that we develop through awareness and mindfulness practice. And he says this is the message, right? The message that cessation is not regarded as pure cessation or the complete answer when thinking about the third noble truth, but the message is that it's possible. So what I think he is getting at there, and what he's saying directly too, is that we just have to be open-minded to the message that cessation, liberation from suffering is possible. And I think, that we have glimpses of this, and sometimes we don't recognize it, and sometimes we do. But the feeling is one of freedom. We're not tossed around by our environment. We're not tossed around by the lens and filters that we put on our experience. We just see experience as it is. When it comes to thoughts or feelings, we can label them as pleasant or unpleasant. But once we start, labeling them as good or bad, as something we have to hold on to or get rid of, we are enslaved to them. We're tormented by them, right? And that's the liberation that we're seeking. That's the cessation of suffering that is possible, the liberation from being enslaved, to our thoughts and to our feelings and to our, neuroses and all that stuff. Someone else put it like this, and I really like this. It's called freedom from the bondage of self, because that's what it is. We're in bondage. We're enslaved to the needs of our ego, the needs to be recognized, the needs to be seen, the needs to hold on to pleasant thoughts, the need to avoid unpleasant thoughts. It's a bondage. So the first step, he says, is to realize that we are in this samsaric mess. We are in this cycle of avoiding pain, holding on to pleasure. And the more we are trapped into that cycle, the more we are enslaved, and the more we don't have choices, and the more we can, our experience is contracted as opposed to expanded, which is what happens in awakening and blossoming, right? And then he says that's precisely why we were in samsara, because we don't know what we are doing, or we know what we are doing, and we know it's negative consequences on some level, but we still keep doing it. And coincidentally, or not so coincidentally, because some people do define it this way, this is the same definition of addiction, that we keep doing the same thing over and over again despite its negative consequences. And we can talk more about that at some other point, but I think there are some pretty common reasons why we do that, but maybe for another time, okay? And he says even in being a ping pong ball, there still are gaps, of not being a ping pong ball. If we think of actually watching people play ping pong, there's that, in between period before, the ball reaches the other paddle, where, the ball is just in space and just, in the space that we all share before it gets, hit by another ping pong paddle and just starts all over again. But these gaps are something, are something else. The gaps between the two paddles are something else, and this is where our awareness takes place, without being, without being influenced by our environment. And this is the experience of awareness that this is the glimpse that we can have, that we can pay attention to when it's happening, right? But he also warns us, though, not to if we get caught up in the conceptual realization of that thought, that can lead to spiritual materialism, and that's just another form of fixation. So, the concept of being liberated, the concept of having glimpses of, freedom and awareness, pure awareness, if we, turn that in, if we reify that by turning that into a concept or a goal that we, have to achieve, then that just becomes another fixation or another story, as we've talked about before here. Right. Says the basic point is to experience cessation rather than to have a theory or a dream about it. Talking about the concept of sensation is different than sensation, the experience of sensation itself, right? Our mind, in awareness, we are experiencing the faculty of mind that just knows without conceptual thought. Like if we are looking at a mountain, before we get into the whole concept of the mountain that we're so conditioned to doing anything with, thinking about things conceptually, we just know it's a mountain without having to, getting into any kind of complicated thinking about it. And that's the experience of just pure awareness, just the faculty of mind that just knows as it is. Right. And he goes on further to warn us that, that too much description of this experience can just become another obstacle on the path, meaning it can just become another concept and not having anything to do with our experience of it. And the teachings, and to this point, the teachings should be based purely on the level of workability and direct personal experience, rather than trying to, rely on our conditioned way of thinking about it conceptually, right? So he says in the context of practice, as long as the approach is free from samsara, meaning free from fixation, free from bewilderment, free from, you know, the attachment, we can hear the details of the path, we can learn, we can study like we're doing now, and it's not particularly problematic. You know, we can develop a very detailed and precise understanding of the nature of the path based on the process of coming back to mindfulness and awareness. Again, coming back to practice. The suggestion is that practice, the suggestion is the same suggestion about how do you get to Carnegie Hall. Practice, 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 right? He's saying the problem is at this point, though, we don't have anything but samsara and just little points of light that rise in the midst of darkness. So our first alternative to samsara is our practice again, and that brings us through the journey of the Four Noble Truths. And that seems to be the only way, he says. We have come back to becoming like a Buddha through our practice, through our awareness practice. And goes on to say that the third noble truth is very simple, that nirvana is possible. And that's all we have to get from the message, that it's possible. Because if we put more into the message than just the possibility, we're going to get stuck on the goal and miss the fact that the path is the goal, right? The journey is the destination. You know, by focusing too much on the goal, by making, reifying this concept of the cessation of suffering, we're going to focus on that, and then that's, counterproductive because we're going to be missing everything along the way if we're too focused on the end, right? He equates this to that the message is like seeing the message that it is possible is like seeing a star in the middle of the sky of a new moon night, and eventually you are inspired by the crescent moon, the full moon, and then by the dawn, and finally you are inspired by the whole thing. The message is like seeing a star in the middle of the sky on a new moon light, right? And then finally, as dawn awakens, as dawn arises, we can appreciate the whole thing, right? So we have moments of experiencing, glimpses of sensation, and that we can extend these glimpses through practice, right? And then he goes on to repeat what I had said in the summary, in the introductory summary, that what the Buddha taught in his first sermon when he delivered the teachings of the Four Noble Truths, which he repeated 4 times, he said, cessation of suffering could be experienced. He said that suffering should be known, right? Because we can't experience a cessation of something unless we know it, right? The origin of suffering should be renounced, meaning attachment, fixation. We should, in terms of it being renounced, that we should know that this is the origin of suffering, right? And the cessation of suffering should be realized as a result of knowing all this, and the path should be regarded as the truth to resolution. And he says that's what the Buddha has said, word for word. So the message is cessation of suffering is possible, and that's all we have to know, because if we get too caught up in it's more than possible, it's something that we will achieve and that has to be achieved, that just becomes another story and is an obscuration to pure, simple awareness and liberation. And now Philip is going to tell us how to do that.
So, thank you, Dan, and welcome, everyone. So tonight I want to talk about chapter 57, meditation as the path to Buddhahood. And this follows directly from what Dan was just talking about. This is a short chapter, very straightforward, and it's very delightful. There's a refreshing shift of tone that comes with the third noble truth, the truth of cessation, and this chapter is saturated with that. Chögyam Trungpa begins by talking about contrast and choice, samsara, nirvana, sanity, insanity, in-breath, out-breath. One experiences a gap at the end of the out-breath. He says relating to that gap is relating to the contrast between samsara and nirvana. So we have time here. I'm going to tell you a little story that I heard Pema Chodron relate. And she was describing a meditator and a teacher at a long retreat. And the setup there was that every few days, the student could go to the teacher for an audience. And so this student would go to his teacher and say, well, how do I meditate? And the teacher would give him an answer. And then they'd go back 3 days of sitting and then go back again. And he'd say the same thing. How do I meditate? And the teacher would give him another answer. 9 days, same thing. 12 days, same thing. It turns out this student was from a tradition where that was the technique. You just ask the same question over and over again. But the teacher was not from that tradition, and he was getting pretty annoyed. So the last time they met, the fifth time, he made it clear that he wasn't going to answer this question after this answer. And this was his answer. He said, do you know when you have a thought and then there's another thought? And the student goes, yeah. And the teacher says, well, and in between those two thoughts, there's a little gap. And the student says, yes. And the teacher says, make that gap bigger. That was it. That's the gap that Chögyam Trungpa was talking about here. One experiences a gap at the end of the out-breath. Relating to that gap is relating to the contrast between samsara and nirvana. It's a good idea to have in your head because you come back to it over and over and over as the years roll by. It's like an access point. But getting back to this chapter, Chögyam Trungpa says the traditional analogy for the cessation of suffering is the blowing out of a candle. This refers, though, to the final stage of cessation, when one has become a Buddha. He says the liberated state of mind could be different or have a different style for each individual. This becomes more evident in the Vajrayana practices. But what we are concerned with now, however, is training. He says as far as Hinayana is concerned, it is simply a question of experiencing basic liberation. And attaining liberation takes work. So this is the first theme that runs throughout this chapter, this theme of effort. The third noble truth, the cessation of suffering, this one, is connected with the fourth noble truth, the path, or lam in Tibetan. Cessation and the path work together. The path consists of following the example of the Buddha through the practice of meditation, through mindfulness and awareness. Chögyam Trungpa says, the reason that Hinayana is known as the lesser vehicle is because it is straight and narrow. There is no improvisation. With Hinayana, we can develop what is known as individual salvation. Hinayana is self-disciplined, straight, and simple. It is simple in the sense that there is not much to do other than just fully being here. The second theme also runs throughout this chapter, and for that matter, the chapter that Dan was just describing. Simple, continuous, natural effort. Then he speaks of Xinjiang. He's spoken of this before in earlier chapters. He says the path of meditation also leads to Xinjiang, being thoroughly processed or trained, which is the result or achievement of shamatha vipassana meditation. He cautions us against hope for enlightenment or expectation of enlightenment. Hope and expectations become obstacles. just what Dan was describing. He talks about the journey, the long journey of Hinayana. Again, what Dan was describing. We've heard this before. The path is the goal. He describes Xinjiang as happening in stages. The early stage is the achievement of clarity, a glimpse of what it would be like if one achieved permanent cessation. He says that when one develops Xinjiang, the sense of turmoil and misery subsides. Physically and mentally, there's a feeling of comfort, simplicity, tremendous relief. He cautions again that one doesn't look for final results or become goal-oriented. One simply keeps on practicing. Achievement comes naturally. He repeats that too conscious an effort can be a problem. It becomes an ego-oriented approach. Attaining individual salvation does not come from seeking salvation. Salvation simply dawns. He talks about meticulousness extending throughout life, all aspects of life, based on natural mindfulness. He uses oryoki practice as an illustration of this. That's in some retreats, and in this tradition, it's a Japanese, very formalized method of eating. It's related sort of to the tea ceremony, where mindfulness is paid to every step. And the idea is that we can go through our entire life like that, paying attention to every step. And it automatically makes everything work. He talks about reminders as a final achievement of Xinjiang, reminders that come from having developed discipline. He compares this level of Xinjiang to a deep friendship. When sloppiness happens, the sloppiness itself serves as a reminder to bring us back. A natural system of checks and balances begins to take place. In that way, we slowly become like the Buddha. Every little detail of one's life develops meaning. This is not so different from the way we begin to automatically recognize and return from discursive thoughts while we're meditating. There's an awareness beyond thinking, a knowingness that recognizes when we are thinking. That knowingness is what people refer to as clarity or luminosity. The nature of mind is described as that clarity, emptiness and clarity, emptiness and luminosity, space and awareness. This develops naturally over time with practice. This is that gap between the two thoughts that Buddhist teacher was describing. Just expand that gap. Chogyam Trungpa says there's a natural and dignified way to do everything, and life becomes soothing rather than a situation of suffering. That is why shamatha is known as the development of peace. It's not pleasure seeking, but harmony. We don't create chaos for ourselves or others. And we start first by working with ourselves. He finishes this chapter by talking about the traditional 4 ways of taking care of ourselves, taking care of our body and developing wholesomeness. He goes through them quickly. The first is relating properly to food with attention and moderation. That's the oryoki, if you want, as a good example or illustration. 2, relating properly to rest with attention and moderation. This is the whole lesson, paying attention. 3, taking care of oneself, one's appearance and one's environment, how to handle things, meticulousness, just another word for attention. Attention to every detail, all of the time. And 4, of course, meditation. Such wholesomeness leads one to develop the state of individual salvation. He says working with oneself is a 3-fold process. Outer form brings inner feeling, which brings a deep sense of freedom. That is to say, things get better with practice. The more you do anything, the better you get at it. That's how it works. Everything is like this. One eventually establishes good habits. Things become natural, automatic. And so he concludes this chapter. It's very reassuring. If you want a takeaway, it would be this: just sit. Just sit. Make practice a daily habit if you haven't already. Make it as routine as brushing your teeth. And I say this to you as a dentist. Thanks for your attention and for your practice.
Thank you, Dan and Philip. It's great. Such beautiful material. Really about life affirming. And so simple. We could have a discussion.
Vicky.
Yes, I just wanted to say I love Thursday nights more than anything. I mean,
That's so
I
sweet.
you know, the Shawnee Davis stuff is great, but I just drive on Thursday night, and if I miss it or parts of it, I'm always listening to the recordings. It's just, you all are just do a fantastic job. I know at presenting this. It's so beautiful. It's such a relief to hear this. I admit
Thanks,
when I
Vicky.
first, oh, you're welcome. When I
That's
first came to,
really nice
first
to receive that feedback.
yeah, when
I
I first
find
came
Thursday
to
nights
the group,
nerve-wracking myself, but it's great.
No, Philip, please, you did a great job.
no, it's terrific. Just every time. And when I first came here, I had missed the Hinayana, so this is just like I get to start all over and really get it. So
This is such a
thank you.
marvelous version of the Hinayana. Drink Rinpoche infuses it with such meaning and depth.
And makes it simple, makes it easy to grasp.
After last night, what comes to my mind is well said, well said. O daughter of noble family.
I can
Yes,
tell you,
one of the things that really impresses me with Chogyam Trungpa's teaching, what John is alluding to, is that throughout all of this, without your even being aware of that, seeds are being planted. And so a year from now, that seed will sprout and you'll think, oh, I first heard this, you know, from Dan 12 months ago, or from John 8 months ago. It's lovely.
Yeah, and sometimes I find it goes backwards too. Like the diligence chapter in Shanti Deva, I'm like, I was a little befuddled about it, you know, just it wasn't quite ringing true as patience. But then I hear this, and it's like, just keep coming back, just keep coming back, you know, and then it's like that's exactly what John keeps saying, and that's exertion and effort, and you know, rehabituating the mind, which is how Shanti Deva opens up the text. He's like, I'm saying this just to habituate my own mind. I think is like one of the lines in there of how he opens it up. And that's early on with John. That's what he says, that I want you to develop a meditation practice. I'm like, oh, okay, that I've never had anybody say that to me before. What did, you know, and I'm starting to get it. And here we are.
That's exactly right, Fred.
and that speaks to the bewilderment that we've been talking about in this first chapter, right? Our conditioned bewilderment, right? It's our conditioned way of thinking about things in terms of being responsive to our environment, and that leads to this bewilderment, and we don't even know we're bewildered until we do through practice, right? But I was going to quickly share with Vicky, as a response to Vicky too. I really could relate to what you were saying, and I really appreciate what you were saying too. And my samsaric shared experience of that, of what you're saying is that, when John first asked me if I wanted to be involved, of course I was thrilled on one level, but on Thursday nights. But I also had this immediate resistance to, oh, do I want to go back and do all this again, right? Say all this again. But I recognized it. I recognized it immediately as it's probably partly as defenses to what Philip was just talking about in terms of performance anxiety, but my immediate resistance, I could, as a result of everything we've been talking about here and practice, I recognized it. I recognized it as a hook. I recognized it as this kind of sticky, natural reaction to, to something. It was just, it was hooking something. It was creating this uncomfortable feeling, but I was able to recognize it. And I was able to recognize it as thinking. I just recognize it as thinking. And that's all I had to do, because it does just, when you recognize it as thinking, we don't reify it. We don't reify this value judgment, this value judgment I'm making, like, I don't want to go back there again and then just rehearse the story. As soon as I recognize it as thinking, it dissipates. Sometimes gradually, sometimes quicker, but it dissipates. Just by not reifying it, not rehearsing it, not being stuck in the cycle of over and over and over again. Thank you, Vicky.
Thank you for sharing that.
Thank you, both of you, Vicky and Dan.
So Dan has mentioned that the Buddhists talk about 6 consciousnesses, and it took me a long time to appreciate this. And like with so many things in Buddhism, I'm still appreciating it. But there are the 5 sense consciousnesses, and then there's also this 6th one, which is the mind consciousness. And I think we start off thinking that they're entirely different and that there's something very special about the mind consciousness. But in fact, the 6 are equal. And so when Dan is talking about thoughts, you could consider thoughts as essentially no different than a sound or a smell or a touch, because they are just that transient and they are just that important or unimportant. They're really of the same nature. And yet, in samsara, we spend all of our time bound up with our thoughts, enslaved to our thoughts. Bondage was the word that Dan used. Slaves to our thinking. And really, when you get down to it, our thoughts are not that, what's the word? They're not that brilliant, They're just like, we're missing the whole universe because we're enslaved to our thoughts. Yeah.
Sarah.
Okay, Philip, I have a question to that one, because when you get into Vajrayana, they talk about the whole thing becoming luminous. So you just said thoughts are the opposite of luminous, but yet we're supposed to see it all as luminous. So then how do you get there? Or yeah.
Okay, that's a really good question. And I'm going to put something in chat if I can. So Ellen recommended this book to me. And on one hand, it's got nothing to do with Buddhism, right? It's fiction. But Ann Patchett is a wonderful, wonderful writer. And if you look at this sentence, this is why she's a wonderful writer. And I want to read it. The rage dissipates along with the love, and all we're left with is a story. So if you look at that sentence, you'll realize that's Vajrayana Buddhism, right? That's the nature of mind. That's luminosity and emptiness merged together. The rage and the love, that's apparent reality. And the story, that's the real reality. That's the relative truth and the absolute truth. And yet they are merged together. And the transience is there too, because the rage dissipates and the love dissipates. What are we left with? We're left with the story. Where does the rage come from? It comes from the story. Where does the love come from? It comes from the story. Where do they go? Back to the story. Story is just a word. You could call it ground. You could call it Mahamudra. You could call it Alya, but that word has always confused me. But it's that base. It's the, right now, infinite potential seems like the best way to describe it. It's what the mind is. It's what reality is. It's what the universe is. You asked a long time ago, Sarah, how can nirvana and samsara become one? That's also in this sentence, rage and love. It's because they're both empty. It's because they're both just that apparent reality, because they arise from that same place and go back to that same place. They are essentially the same. They're no different from a sound or a smell or a touch. Thoughts, emotions, feelings, passions, it's all the same thing. Does that answer your question?
Well, do you get to a point where you see all of the thoughts as a blessing?
All the thoughts is what?
A
Yes,
blessing?
yes. We are
Blessing.
remarkably, a blessing, a blessing. We are remarkably lucky. And the most tragic thing we do is fail to appreciate that. We are amazingly lucky. So all those things are blessings. Sounds, sights. That's the luminosity that John is talking about when he uses the word that way. That's the brilliance of the universe.
But they are
So
only
what is love? Love is pain. It's love, pain, and the whole damn thing, right? All three of those things are blessings, and they all come together.
And I refer you to volume 3 of the Profound Treasury, the bottom part of page 400 to the top part of page 401, about the unnecessariness, if you will, of thought. He doesn't pull any punches. But you have to realize too, Kensei Rinpoche, great teacher, Dogo Kensei Rinpoche, who was one of Trungpa Rinpoche's teachers and also a dear friend. They loved each other very much. And he came here to this country, Kensei Rinpoche, and they spent a lot of time together. He called what Trungpa Rinpoche taught the backwards path of Ati, meaning that he taught the final reality and backwards into all the way down into the very beginning teachings, which we're studying now, the Four Noble Truths, the first words out of the Buddha's mouth after his enlightenment. And then it just came all the way down to that. There was somebody, one of Rinpoche's students wrote a book about it, Backwards Path of Ati. But I hear it here. And in this question that you raised, Sarah, about luminosity and emptiness, that's very Ati. Ati means the last stage of the path in the Nyingma scheme. Dzogchen in Tibetan, Ati in Sanskrit. Trungpa Rinpoche, because Dzogchen literally means Dzog is perfection, Chen is great. So in the Sanskrit, it's just called Ati. Ati is like the last syllable or letter in the Tibetan alphabet. So it's Ne plus ultra, it's the end. But he called it Maha-Ati, sort of translating from the Tibetan into Sanskrit. Maha means great, like great perfection. And really the essence of Ati is the union. That reality is the union of emptiness, which is beyond thought, and luminosity, the luminous nature of phenomena as they arise and pass away. That they're so beautifully luminous and vivid when we are not distracted by thought. It gives rise to all the poetry gives rise to the tantras. All the tantras are come out of that appreciation of the union of emptiness, the emptiness of our neurotic thoughts, but they're gone, and what's revealed in that space, which is the beauty of this world as it arises in the instant, moment to moment.
It occurs to me, Sarah, another way of answering your question, listening to John, is that we could be, as is so often the case in Buddhism, using the same word to talk about different levels. So when we talk about early on letting go of thoughts, what we're really talking about is letting go of our own ego. And what you're talking about, perhaps when you're talking about Vajrayana, luminous thoughts, that's different than, the Philip Russell thought that destroys the whole experience of the world because he's worried about an argument that he had with his ex-wife 10 years ago and is still chewing around back here. That's one kind of thought. But another kind of thought is appreciating the beauty of the world at the moment it's here.
Or I'll tell you a story. I was living with Trungpa Rinpoche down in further down the canyon, about 1970, 71. We walked out of the front door one day, and we're standing there side by side. And I hear him say, "Beautiful day, eh?" It didn't sound right. And I looked at him, and he looked at me, and he said, "It can be an obscenity because you're trying to make it into something. You see, it's like the fact of it isn't enough. You want to make it, you want to crank it up by saying, beautiful day, eh?" That's what he was saying to me. I was going, ah. I mean, and I'm telling you this 50 years later because it was such a teaching. Making
Well,
it more than it was, trying to
yeah.
crank up something between us, as it were.
Well, and that leads me to Philip's example, because it kind of seems like you're saying one thought's better than another thought. So like maybe there is like something about being reminded of your argument from 10 years ago because it's pointing to something. So it's actually another teaching of where you are, right? Maybe.
Yes, but I think it also, Sarah, I think that's a good point, but it also always comes down to recognizing thinking as thinking, because then it can be luminous, just as we don't have much of a problem recognizing a luminous sight, a beautiful lamp or something, as we don't take ownership of it or definition from it, or we're not lost in it. We can see it as luminous, just see it, right? We can do the same thing with thoughts, but we have to recognize thinking as thinking, because when we're lost in thought, it can't be luminous. When we recognize thinking as thinking, we have the clarity to see the luminosity. Right? Clarity is the rigpa, the wisdom, that allows us to see the luminosity.
Yeah, that's well said. So you can come back to the six consciousnesses. We could appreciate a thought the same way we see a rainbow or hear a symphony. What these chapters are saying is don't get too involved with trying to make that happen. Just meditate, and this will happen by itself. This will just gradually unfold. This is the world that we live in. We just get it wrong. And there are more and more and more layers that we get wrong. But that's okay. It gets better and better and better with every single step. I learned the other day that dogs can't see the color green. And it made me think of my favorite dog, Sasha, who was half German Shepherd and half Siberian Husky. And I would hike with her in Vermont for hundreds of miles, literally, not all at one trip, but for over the years. And we would appreciate the beautiful green mountains. And I would sit there with my arm around her shoulder. She was a pretty big dog, and just appreciate the beautifulness, the lushness of Vermont in the spring, 100 shades of green. But guess what? She never saw that green. That wasn't her reality. That was just my reality. It's a human reality. It's like, I can do with my own ego, and then I run into the species ego, right? Because I'm a human, I think everybody sees the world the same way with human eyes. Well, they don't. Yeah. So Sasha never saw green. That's not to say that the world wasn't any more or less amazing to her than it was to me, but it was different. We were each of us just seeing a tiny slice of what's really out there.
I'd just like to read you some things that I highlighted from this chapter for myself. He says, and this is just skipping, it's not continuous. We are trying to awake from the sleep of pain and suffering and blossom, be wakeful. That's what we're trying to do. We are trying to awake from the sleep of pain and suffering and blossom, be wakeful, through the practice of mindfulness and awareness meditation. Though the glimpse may be short and small, he says, give up speed and fixation and cultivate mindfulness and awareness and transcend spiritual materialism, wanting to get something. The only way is the practice of mindfulness awareness, which brings us through the journey of the Four Noble Truths, the only way. And then finally, he concludes this. The Buddha said cessation could be experienced, the cessation of suffering, through the Four Noble Truths. He said that suffering should be known. The origin of suffering should be renounced. The cessation of suffering should be realized. And the path should be regarded as the truth to resolution. And then this is Trungpa Rinpoche speaking. That's almost word for word. I mean, it's really beautiful. Mindfulness and awareness.
Just to expand on that, he says right before that point, I read it before, but I think it's a very profound statement. Our first alternative to samsara is the practice, right? So that's the alternative to samsara.
Yeah.
Samsara mess is our practice of mindfulness awareness.
I just think that thing that he did on the front steps of the house, how many times have I stood looking with someone else at a scene like the ocean or a mountain scene, and we're both saying to each other, isn't it beautiful? Cranking it up, trying to crank it up into something that you can hold on to. And he's saying, that's obscene to do. You should just, that's what he said to me, basically. These teachings, this is Hinayana teachings, right? This is volume 1. This is amazing stuff. I studied Dzogchen, Great Perfection. I've been studying with Khenpo Namdrol a teacher for 20 years, a little over 20 years, Sugden. This is it. We're getting it in volume 1 of the Profound Treasury. It's really amazing.
Often on Tuesday nights when we're going over the way of the Bodhisattva, I say, I think it happens practically every Tuesday night now. It's like, wait, aren't we going over this on Thursday?
Really?
Yeah,
That's what I feel. There's not much difference.
right.
And at the same time, he says in there, at this point, you just have to get a notion of it. Just sit and you may get that little experience. Like, don't get ahead of yourself. It's really amazing the way he conveys these teachings with the, and I know that I saw, or in a talk, I heard him say that his intention was to present the Hinayana from a Vajrayana perspective.
That's good, Barry. Thank you. That makes sense. Yeah.
And Trungpa uses the most colorful metaphor for that the cessation of suffering. What does he call it? An appetizer, right? It's like, okay. And he's like, it's going to make you hungrier for more. And you can start to see the momentum, the self-generated momentum that comes from the practice. It gets easier and easier, and it's encouraging. It really, really is.
And it's not the first time he used orgasm as an example of what he was talking about.
Yep, that too. Such great metaphors. He really knew how to capture the Western audience attention and to communicate this.
So I want to encourage Tanya and Karamera and other new people to share their questions and concerns. Because Tuesday nights and Thursday nights have become really similar, and I worry sometimes that that's not so good for newer people.
Okay, this is Teddy Meta speaking, and I missed half of, hold on a second. I missed a lot of tonight because the phone was charging and then I was driving. But I'm going to look at the videos and I'll sure have some questions next week. And even earlier this week, I didn't hear a lot of it. Well, actually, I didn't get on the meeting on one of the days this week. But thanks. I don't have any intelligent questions right now because I didn't hear what was said mostly. I do have a question about karma though, but I'll see what I can learn from what you were talking about. I think it was yesterday. Thanks.
I'm glad you're here.
Yeah, me too.
And I'm just steadily working along on my path in terms of the idea or concept of fear. I found Rinpoche's book on called Smiling at Fear. And so right now I'm having a bunch of different thoughts and ideas swirling around, and I'm working through it. And that's where I'm at.
That can be a good place to be.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Is it helpful?
I'm not complaining. I like it.
Good appetizer, sounds like.
You might want to check out Pema's book or it might be in conjunction with Trunk, but or combination, but From Fear to Fearlessness, right?
Mhm.
So, it's on that same path. Yeah.
Okay.